Anyone doesn't have a seat yet, feel free to sit up here. We have a nice little ledge. You can also stand or sit wherever you can find room. But my name is Trevor Buckman. I am the president of the UNI Freethinkers and Inquirers, and I want to welcome you all to our finale of Darwin Week. Thank you all so much for coming out. As I'm sure you've heard from all the other events that you've attended, on your seats you have a rating card. If you could, at some point before you leave, fill that out and give us some feedback for the future, that would be wonderful. But I am thrilled tonight to introduce our last speaker of Darwin Week 2011, Mr. Dan Barker. Dan is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, co-host of Free Thought Radio, and author of the books Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists, and his new book, just out, The Good Atheist, Living a Purpose-Filled Life Without God. Dan is a speaker that we've wanted to have on campus since the inception of Darwin Week, and I am absolutely thrilled to have him here tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Dan Barker.
Thank you, Trevor. And thank you, Unify, Cody, and who else? Quinn, and Michael, and Alex, and who else did I meet? All you great freethinkers on campus. I was here for a debate with Michael Horner, and I bet few of you were here. I think it was 1992. We debated the resurrection of Jesus in some big hall. And I don't recall that there was any skeptical free thought agnostic group on campus at that time. I was invited by some department and a bunch of Christian groups to do this debate. And at that time, I could have counted maybe, in my memory, 5 or 10 groups around the country that were like what you guys have. It was just maybe a handful here and there of some very brave individuals. And but something has happened since then. Something's happened in America. Something's happening in the West and in the world. Free thought, non-belief is growing really fast. In fact, you know what the fastest growing religion is in the United States right now? It's non-religion. Well, you guys know that, right? Non-religion is the fastest growing quote-unquote religion. And there's a lot of signs that that is true, including the growth of campus groups like Unify, campus groups all over the country. Today, the Secular Student Alliance counts 250 or maybe 255 campus groups around the country, and they're sprouting up all over the place. That's an amazing sign that something's happening. This generation, you guys in this college age right now, you're the least religious ever in this country. And that's something to be proud of. That's something that's happening. There's a lot of reasons why Europe today is almost thoroughly secular. And scholars and experts have tried to analyze that. It might have had something to do with just their rich history of religious divisiveness and the wars and the Catholics killing Protestants. It might have had something to do with World War II. But whatever, after centuries of deep religious devotion, Europe right now is pretty much godless. In Denmark, it's about 4% who go to church. And in other countries, especially the Nordic countries, it's less than 10%. And why is that? Whatever the reason is, it happened organically. It didn't happen from the top down. It wasn't like a bunch of atheist missionaries went over to Europe and said, we're going to convert all of you. We're going to make you join our non-religious. That didn't happen. There was no upward down pressure from above. It was just an organic thing that happened among the people, among we the people. And that's the way it should be. Free thought is free thought, with nobody bossing, nobody directing, no pope, no dictator, no king, monarch telling you what to think. We all think our own thoughts, and that's real freedom. This is kind of a movement that has no followers. It's a strange movement. Most movements have followers, and they have like, leaders in that. But here's a movement, just organic atheism from the bottom up, or agnosticism, happening, and we see it's happening here on this campus. It's happening all over the country, and I say it's about time. It's pretty amazing that that's happening. So we're catching up with Europe. Europe has a bunch of gorgeous, empty churches, supported with tax dollars, and so they don't have to hustle. In the United States, we're one of the outliers. We and Ireland are the two basic outliers in the West. although Ireland is real fast trying to catch up with the rest of Europe. Today's youth in Ireland are really fed up with their past, and they're fed up with being one of the outliers. They want to catch up. They want to be part of the modern world. And look what's happening to the church in Ireland. They used to export priests, and now what's happening? They can't even fill their own pulpits. And the youth, I was there in Dublin for a debate with Richard Swinburne a couple years ago, and the young people there said they are not their parents' generation. They're thinking for themselves. They're casting off the authority and the tradition and saying, we're going to make our own life and think our own thoughts and make a better world. Religion had its chance, and religion has blown it. Religion has caused divisiveness. And these young people in Dublin cited the scandals in the church as one of the reasons why the credibility of religion has gone way, way down. And I think we see that here. I think we can see the credibility of religion and religious leaders has gone way, way, way down. Another sign that something's happening is books. 10 years ago, if you wanted to find an atheist book in your local bookstore, where would you look?
In the religion section.
Religion section, yeah, or maybe the philosophy. You'd look through it and you'd go, oh, there's one. Oh, there's one. But today, I can walk into my bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin. That's where we are. And I can ask them, where's your atheist books? And there's a section of atheist books. It has there's Catholicism, Islam, Buddhism, atheism, with about 20, 25, 30 titles. About 3 years ago, a publisher came to me on the heels of the phenomenal success of people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, Victor Stenger, the so-called new atheists. And of course, they will admit there's nothing new about atheism. It's the same stuff. But what's new about it is that atheists are coming out more. That's what's new about the new atheism. And who would have thought that there would be a market? Do you think Dawkins' books created the market, or was the market already there? What do you think? It was there, right? There was a hunger. There was this organic, I don't think anybody can write a book and change the world. The world's changing, and he's noticing that, and he's elaborating that. So a publisher came to me. They saw that the Freedom from Religion Foundation book that I wrote back in '92 was doing pretty well as a kind of self-published book, and they said, how would you like to brush that off? Tell your story and update your story of having been a preacher who became an atheist after 19 years of preaching. And so I did that, and the book came out in 2008. It's called Godless, and I think there's a few copies left on the table back there. It's my own story of how I changed, and Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword to the book, which was a real pleasure to have. And in fact, he's a better writer than I am, so you'll probably like his foreword better than my book. But he said in the book, and you have to tell me if this is a compliment or not. I'm not sure. He says in the foreword, Dan Barker is the most eloquent witness of internal delusion that I know. He said Dan was not just a preacher. He was the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. And I was that guy. I was that guy on campus. I dedicated my life to Jesus. I became born again. I was filled with the Spirit. I accepted a call to the ministry. I really believed it. I got goosebumps. I used to pray and I would feel, in fact, I can still do it. I can still go back into that mode. I can still go back into that mystical mode, and I can pray. I'm not going to do it here, but I can pray in tongues, and I get this feeling, and it's like a presence here, and this peace, and this excitement. The mystical experience, the religious experience is very real, and it's very powerful. But I think your susceptibility to it varies across a bell curve of characteristics. Some of you know what I mean. Some of you are like me. You're over here on this end, and you get those feelings. Some of you are over here and you don't know what the heck I'm talking about. You went to church and you tried to feel it and you didn't, but others of you went and you did. And I did, and it was an amazing thing. I used to get goosebumps, not realizing at the time that goosebumps are actually an evidence for evolution. Did you know that? Why do we get goosebumps?
Stand up.
Yeah, because our ancestors were hairy, and for thermal control, right? You've seen birds and other animals do that. You fluff up your fur. Or to make yourself look larger, to scare off an enemy, an attacker, right? So when do you get goosebumps? When you're cold and when you're scared, right? Usually. Or sometimes when you're excited about something weird or special, you get goosebumps when you're excited. But anyway, I thought it was a proof of the Holy Spirit. I didn't think it was proof of evolution. And I'm not going to tell that story today, how I changed my mind from preacher to atheist. If you're interested, it's in the book Godless. But very briefly, I discovered, to my own reluctant disappointment because I love my Christian life, I discovered that Christianity is not true. It's simply not true. There's some truth in the Bible, but there's a lot of contradictions. There's a lot of non-scientific things in the Bible. In fact, in Genesis, I used to think Adam and Eve were real people for a long time, until I realized, oh, there's metaphor in the Bible. And if evolution happened, how could Adam and Eve have been, what, the first souls, right? But I took it literally, and it was really painful for me to realize that just like when Jesus made up a story, a parable of the prodigal son, that the historicity wasn't important, but the message was important. Well, you know, the Bible is filled with stories, and the early Israelites made up a story about Adam and Eve with the talking snake. And by the way, we don't know what the snake was. The Hebrew word there is nachash. We think it was a snake, but we don't know what that creature was because it used to walk on all fours, and then it was cursed and it went sliding on its belly. There's evolution for you right there. An animal evolved from one thing to another. But in any event, I used to believe all that, but I realized that Christianity itself is not true. It has some truth in it. It would be surprising if it didn't, but as a whole it's not. There's no evidence for a God. There's no coherent definition of a God. There's no agreement among believers as to the nature or the moral principles of this God. There's no answers to the positive arguments against a God, like the problem of evil. There really is no answer to the problem of evil. Theologians have to tinker with definitions to make it work somehow. And there's about 6 or 8 different theodicies that people have come up with to try to explain that problem. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no God, or at least there's no loving God. There might be a cruel God, because look at, you know, everybody's praying, and it isn't interesting that the people, some people do get better. Some people spontaneously remit and their cancer goes away, and we go, praise God, He healed me. I prayed for Grandma and she didn't die. She died 3 weeks later, but she didn't die, praise God. But what about all the people here who prayed? And in fact, it would be a true miracle if prayers were never answered. That would be a true miracle, because by statistics, by coincidence, some prayers have to be answered. And when you're a believing Christian and you pray, and I used to pray for all sorts of things, and once in a while it would happen. I laid hands on my buddy Gary, who had lost his voice. He was supposed to preach, and I said, Gary, in the name of Jesus, be healed. And Gary said, praise the Lord. And he went up and preached, and he sang. I saw a miracle, right? Can you deny that, especially if you're a believer like I was, it's affirming. But you tend to count the hits and ignore the misses. It's the confirmation bias is what it's called. I forgot about the other 99 times that I prayed and nothing happened, or things got worse, right? You don't count those. You only count the few times when it confirms, which matches up to random chance or coincidence. Then I realized there's no good arguments for a God. The ontological, the teleological design arguments, the cosmological, first cause, all these arguments are just, as Bertrand Russell said, they basically boil down to bad grammar. And finally, I realized there's no need for a God. Millions of good people live happy lives, productive, purposeful, loving, joyful lives that are just as good, if not better, than believers in their daily lives. The statistics show that by almost every measure, with some variance in there, believers are no better off. In fact, born-again Christians have a higher divorce rate than atheists. Did you know that? Born-again Christians watch just as much pornography. In fact, conservative men watch more pornography than liberal men. They take just as many drugs for depression. They have just as many financial problems. Their lives aren't any better off. They have a feeling. They have a feeling inside of joy and peace that they think gives them meaning. But I play jazz piano. I get feelings too. You probably get feelings from all sorts of things that are special to you. Believers have these special feelings, but they don't have a corner on anything that makes their lives any better. And I know that as a fact. You can point to certain groups. I think Mormons as a group are healthier than non-Mormons. Does that mean we should all become Mormons? Because of a dietary thing, you know. Although I think Mormon women have a higher depression rate. Salt Lake City's been called the Prozac capital of the world. You know, because of the way their lives are. But in any event, atheists and agnostics are no worse and no better. There's some horrible atheists in the world. Atheism doesn't pretend to make you this wonderful, great person. It just pretends to remove some obstacles. Hitler was a horrible Christian, but Stalin was a horrible atheist. It doesn't follow that if you're an atheist, you're necessarily this great, wonderful person. Although when I was a preacher, I used to say that giving your life to Jesus would make you a better person in some way. But the Bible also says you shall know them by their fruits. And just look at the fruits of believers through history and today. There's some wonderful Christians, some wonderful Muslims, and I know a lot of them, some great Jews in the world. But as a group, they don't have a corner on anything that we value in this life. But I didn't come to talk about all that. I came to talk about prayer, our National Day of Prayer. We have a national radio show. It's called Free Thought Radio. Trevor, is there some water in the building, like a thing to somebody? Trevor? What did the Bible say? If you give a glass of water to one of the least of these, you've done it unto me, or something. The least of us. Yeah, yeah, okay. I remember I used to preach that, but it's been, what, 26 years now. So. Prayer. In 1952, Billy Graham, the evangelist, had just come into prominence, national prominence, because the Hearst newspapers saw him as a young preacher who was anti-communist. And they said, let's put this guy up front. And they promoted him, they pushed him, and he became a nationally famous evangelist. And Hearst even said, plug this guy, plug this guy. He went to Washington, D.C. in 1952, and he preached, I think it was 6 weeks, a 6-week crusade. Interesting choice of word, right? Revival meetings or faith meetings at the National Armory and on the steps of the National Capitol. And Billy Graham knew a lot of people. He knew members of Congress, and he made a call. He said, we need to set our nation apart. We need to show that we are not these godless, atheistic communists. We are a God-fearing nation. We need to have a day of prayer, a national day of prayer. Did you find something?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
God bless you, Trevor.
Thank you. Great will be your reward. Not in heaven, but so Billy Graham suggested that the United States of America have a National Day of Prayer. In fact, Billy Graham's sermon is in the Congressional Record. And members of Congress introduced a bill, and who in the mid-1950s would dare be seen voting against God? Nobody. McCarthyism, the scare of communism and all of that, everybody had to show how patriotic they were, and at that time, patriotism meant godliness. That's what it meant at the time. The bill passed very easily, and Congress passed a bill requiring that the President of the United States every year issue a proclamation calling on all Americans to pray. The National Day of Prayer. A national day for all Americans. Truman was the first to do it, and every president has done it since then. Well, they have to. It's an act of Congress. They are required to do that by Congress. And in the legislation and in the discussions and in all of the presentation, there was just an overt religious intent. It wasn't for some secular purpose. It was for religious reasons. The ministers, the preachers, the evangelists, they were all saying, yes, America, yes, God bless America, singing Christian hymns and onward Christian soldiers and, you know, this whole rallying around the cross thing. And many of the proclamations over the years included some really bad history. For example, the claim that they had prayer at the Constitutional Convention when our country was formed. That's wrong. That's a lie. There was no official prayer. There might have been some private prayer going on, like anywhere. I mean, even though there's no prayer in the school, as long as there's tests, there's going to be prayer in the school. People are going to be praying private. But officially, there was no prayer at the Constitutional Convention. There was prayer at the earlier Continental Congress, and that thing failed miserably. They prayed there, but they produced a document that was weak and didn't last very long. But at the Constitutional Convention, they produced the Constitution, which has survived more than 2 centuries, the wonderful American principles that are there. Benjamin Franklin got up. He was old, but he got up and he said, let's have a prayer. He asked for a prayer, but there was no second to the motion. They were embarrassed. Future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Jay, said, how can we have a prayer when we all disagree with each other? We're not all in the same, you know, let's leave that to private. There was no prayers at the Constitutional Convention, and there was no mention of the 10 Commandments anywhere in all the minutes. People say our country is based on the 10 Commandments, but they didn't even mention it. How many times do you think they mentioned the Bible during that entire Constitutional Convention? Zero. How many times is the word God in the Constitution? Zero. None. How many times is the word Jesus in there? The Declaration of Independence does mention the Creator and Creator's God, but that was Thomas Jefferson's words, and he was a deist. He was a non-Christian. And for him, the Creator and nature's God was really the deistic God of nature. Or in Jefferson's mind, who said, question with boldness even the existence of a God, the Creator was nature itself. He was sort of a pre-Darwinian freethinker. Before Darwin, those Enlightenment freethinkers were more deistic. They didn't think there was a being up there who wrote books and did miracles and any of that stuff. But they did think there might have been a first cause. And so in Jefferson's mind, there was a natural kind of creator. There's no Jesus in the Declaration. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is quite anti-biblical. The Bible doesn't say anything about democracy or about we the people, the right of the governed to govern themselves. There's no equality in the Bible. All that stuff is Enlightenment, scientific thinking, not biblical teaching. How many times was the word God mentioned at the Constitutional Convention itself? Actually, 3 times. Jefferson's request for prayer, and then somebody got up and said something like, "Good God, we can't have that." That was one mention. And then there was a third mention. I don't remember the exact quote, but it has something to do with comparing, well, are we building a constitution based on the people or based on God? God was not invoked. God was not even a part. Ten Commandments, Bible. Our Constitutional Convention was a totally secular event, although many of the founders were believers. Many of them thought Jesus was real and morality was real. Thomas Jefferson believed in some kind of deity, but he took a pair of scissors to the Bible and he cut out a bunch of the crap. And if you think that's too strong of a word to talk about the Bible, the word that Jefferson used was dunghill. Today he might use a different word, but he wrote a letter to Adams. You can buy that Bible, by the way. Do you know that the Jefferson Bible, he cut out, he said, there's a bunch of, he said, looking for good words of Jesus in the Bible is like digging through a dunghill to find a diamond. Well, he did find some diamonds, and he kept them in, and he cut it, and he cut the New Testament down to a little short, and he said, there, okay, if that's what it means to be a Christian, you could call me a Christian. But he threw out all the miracles, all the crazy stuff, and he said, there's some good teachings in there. It would be surprising if there were not. In any event, in the 1950s, when the National Day of Prayer legislation was passed, and many of these proclamations, they erroneously say we've had, ever since our Constitutional Convention, and ever since then, we've had a regular prayer for our country. That's not true. There have been some proclamations for others. There have been some Thanksgiving proclamations that mention a prayer, but there never was a National Day of Prayer, or a day of prayer. In fact, our first Congress passed a treaty, voted on a treaty that explicitly says to Tripoli, the Bay of Tripoli, that the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian nation. Our founders voted on that, and it was written under Washington, and then it was signed under Adams' presidency. The United States of America is not in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. That was the intent of our founders. But if you listen to the religious right, the whole country was based on Jesus and God and the Bible and the Ten Commandments, and that's why we have our rights, and because we've been endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights and so on. So we thought it was important to correct the historical record. In 1988, some members of the religious right, including Vonette Bright, who was Bill Bright's wife, Campus Crusade for Christ, the honorary chair Pat Boone, an evangelical right-wing entertainer, and others, they were complaining because even though there was this National Day of Prayer that they wanted to observe, there was no fixed date for it. Each president would pick a different day of the year. And some presidents it looked like they forgot about it. It was like the last week of December. Oh, we better have a National Day of Prayer. And they would issue a proclamation. They would write these words and have it proclaimed. The press secretary would proclaim it. And so they said, it's hard for us to organize our religious events around this National Day of Prayer. And they petitioned Congress, and Reagan signed it. They changed it so that the National Day of Prayer now happens on the first Thursday of every May. Last year it was May the 6th. This year it will be May the 5th. So since then, they've been really excited because now they can plan. And that year, a group started called the National Day of Prayer Task Force, which is currently run by a woman named Shirley Dobson. Do you know that name, Dobson? Her husband is James Dobson, who runs Focus on the Family. I think he's just retired or retired. But in any event, the National Day of Prayer Task Force is housed in the same building in Colorado Springs as the Focus on the Family is, James Dobson's group. So it's a real right-wing Christian thing. And our lawsuit, we sued over this, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, found out that all through the whole history of this National Day of Prayer, it's been very divisive. The religious right thinks they own it. And not only have Jews and Muslims and non-believers been frozen out of these events on the state capitals and all that, but even non-evangelical Christians have not been allowed to participate in these events because the right-wing evangelicals think, this is our territory, this is our thing. It kind of reminds me of those territorial animals that like to go around marking off their boundaries, you know, this is ours, this is ours. They want to put their stamp on it. It's supposed to be for all Americans, but it's obviously, it was suggested by the religious evangelical right, Christians. The scripture verses that they pick are all biblical verses. They've never quoted from the Quran. They're all either Judeo-Christian. This National Day of Prayer Task Force writes the proclamation, sends it to the president, and sends it to all the governors. In fact, all the governors of every state have issued this proclamation along with the National Day of Prayer. Even though there's no state day of prayer for these groups, they still want to do it. And a lot of mayors and a lot of county executives, the National Day of Prayer Task Force picks the theme and the Bible verse, and almost always the governors and the president, especially George Bush, when Bush was in office, he took exactly word for word. He took it from this private group and issued the National Day of Prayer in the words and the theme and the Bible verse of this private evangelical group. In fact, George Bush invited them into the White House. They had big parties and big prayer meetings and big revival, and they invited in Shirley Dobson and all these religious right people to come in. Yes, this is a Christian nation. It's a wonderful thing. And almost every governor, there was one governor who refused to do it. Do you know who that was? Do you remember? It wasn't in Iowa. I'll tell you that. But not far from here. Jesse Ventura, one year. He said, I only have civil secular authority that's been granted to me. I've not been granted any religious authority over the people. So what business do I have calling people, the citizens of the state, to pray? If they want to pray, let them pray. That's their thing. It's free. It's a free country. But I'm not going to be involved in it. He was very brave. A little eccentric maybe, but very brave. And maybe they go hand in hand. I don't know. Maybe. I'm not talking about Trevor, of course, but some free thought leaders have that edge to them, which is kind of nice. You know, we're not afraid to be different. But so in Wisconsin, where we live, where I live, the governor has always gone up and they have these big National Day of Prayer meetings in the state capitals. Well, a few years ago, we got a complaint from one of our members. We have 16,000 members around the country now. I remember up in some county north of Madison, Wisconsin, that the sheriff was having a National Day of Prayer breakfast. And the invitation went out from the sheriff's office, the sheriff's stationery, as an official county event. And one of our members up there said, can they do that? Can our secular county get up and actually invite people to a religious meeting? That's different from a private prayer breakfast, which happens all the time, inviting a mayor in, and which is okay. If a mayor goes to one of these, or a county exec goes to one of these private prayer breakfasts, as Obama did with this prayer breakfast just recently, there's another National Prayer Breakfast, which is not even connected with the National Day of Prayer. It's a private event, but it looks kind of like it's a public event. Well, as long as a public official makes it clear that they are attending as a private citizen, not representing the state or the city, that's okay. We're not going to complain about that. But here it was an invitation from the sheriff's office inviting the people to that prayer breakfast in conjunction with the National Day of Prayer on that Thursday, the first Thursday in May. And so we thought, wait, that's crossing the line. There's religious freedom. Those people can have their prayer if they want, but for an elected official to invite people to a prayer breakfast, that's crossing the line. So we decided we would complain and maybe sue in that county, but the plaintiff there, the member, got cold feet and said, I don't want my name. I don't want anybody to know it's me. And you can imagine in some parts of the country, you've got to keep your head down, especially if you're running a business or running a company. Do we have any FFR members here tonight? Oh, some of you came. Wow. how did you hear about it? It was on the webpage, right? Well, thanks. And so maybe, I don't know about Cedar Falls, but there are some areas of the country where you don't let it be known. In fact, we have all met atheists and agnostics, but we just don't know it. Not many of them wear these A pins like I'm wearing, the Richard Dawkins A pin. Because if you're running a business, you don't want that to be known. If your kids are in school, you may not want it to be known, depending on where you live. Some free thought families are very brave, and they don't care, and they'll stand up, and they'll fight, and they'll risk. In fact, they'll risk harm. There's actually harm that comes to some of these families. So we didn't have any teeth. We couldn't make a real complaint in that county. But our attorney, Rich Bolton, was looking at this, and he said, this is actually a national day of prayer thing, and if this sheriff can't do it, how can the president be doing it? And Annie Laurie Gaylor, I'm married to her, we're co-presidents of the foundation and co-hosts of our national radio show. She said, yeah, wow, why don't we sue the president? We can certainly find some plaintiffs there. So we did some research, we did some study, we have some legal injury. We now have 2 full-time staff attorneys. And we looked at the law, we looked at the history, we went down and read the congressional record, we looked at the newspaper, we looked at the whole history of this thing, and we said, this is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. So we sued Bush and his press secretary, but then Obama was elected, and so the names had to change. So now we're suing Obama and the press secretary. Is it still Gibbs, or did Gibbs?
Still Gibbs now.
Still Gibbs, okay. So it was one of the hardest things we've ever done, the amount of work we had to put into that, the history, correcting the record, the precedents from Supreme Court cases, and so on. And we filed it in federal court, and on April 15th of last year, we got the news that Judge Barbara Crabb, a federal judge, ruled in our favor. That the National Day of Prayer is unconstitutional. That was on tax day. And there was a whole bunch of these Tea Party members at the Capitol having a deal that day on tax day. And by the way, we're not a political group or a partisan group. We actually have some Tea Party members in our group. We have a lot of Republicans. We have some conservatives in our group as well. We're not. I think most atheists are liberals, but it doesn't follow that if you don't believe in God, you're necessarily a liberal. We have in our group some anti-abortionists and pro-guns and pro-death penalty people, which to me sounds kind of weird, but that's, that's freedom, right? That's freedom to think. And at our conventions, the table talk is very interesting. We all have different libertarians. So we had a couple communists in the group, and so we're not partisan, but a lot of the Tea Party people were using religious arguments. So we can complain about Democrats or Republicans or anyone else who are using religion to mix religion and government. So on April the 15th, the news came down, and you should have seen our staff after all those months of working. We hadn't even read Barbara Crabb's decision yet, but we were dancing all over the office, and it was pretty exciting. But we did know that Judge Crabb enjoined the President of the United States from issuing a National Day of Prayer proclamation because it's unconstitutional. But pending all the appeals, which meant that he could still do it last May the 6th. He could still go ahead and do it. Within 2 hours of that announcement coming down on April the 15th, the White House sent out a tweet. I doubt that Obama had a chance to read that opinion. He's a constitutional authority, right? He would know these things. I doubt that anybody there had a chance to actually read or analyze the judge's wonderful decision. But the White House sent out this tweet assuring everybody, in light of this decision, we assure you that we're still going to have the National Day of Prayer this year to assure and comfort Americans that they haven't lost their precious day to pray. Because how are they going to pray if the government doesn't hold their hand, right? So, and then they announced right away that they would appeal, and within about a week or 10 days, the administration appealed their loss to the 7th Circuit in Chicago. In December, last December, we had oral arguments in Chicago with a 3-judge panel. And before that time, briefs were filed. We filed our brief to the 7th Circuit. We didn't have to do much work because Judge Crabb did a wonderful job. If you want to read her decision, it's a good, in fact, there's some classes that make it required reading, along with the Jones decision out of Dover. Barbara Crabb's decision is really eloquent, and she disagrees with us about a lot of things. We think under God and the Pledge of Allegiance is wrong, but she doesn't. She thinks under God is okay. She thinks in God we trust on the money is okay. She thinks there's a place in America to acknowledge and accommodate religion. And we agree with that. You can acknowledge religion if you're not pushing it. You can accommodate religion. For example, chaplains in the military, as long as they are passively accommodating military members who might need a chaplain, but there's a good argument for acknowledging and accommodating religion, let's say. But Barbara Crabb, even though she disagreed with us about those things, she thought and thinks that the National Day of Prayer crosses the line. It's more than just an acknowledgement. It's more than just solemnizing an occasion, like what happened in the Marsh decision in Nebraska, which, by the way, the administration, Obama and his lawyers and the other side, have relied on heavily, a very narrow decision that allows legislative prayer at a state capitol within the legislature if it's not directed at the people and if it's non-sectarian. In other words, if it doesn't mention Jesus or any particular religion. That was allowed to stay. Well, everyone's taking that little decision and thinking it's a license, therefore, to do everything we want to. But she analyzed the Marsh decision, and Marsh is all they've got, and it's a bad decision, and it doesn't help them at all. So we had 7 groups file friend of the court briefs for us, amicus briefs, if you know what that is. These, in addition to the real brief that is filed, where you make your case, other groups who have an interest in the issue can ask to file their own brief too, to add information that might help. We had 7 different groups: the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, American Humanist Organization, Center for Inquiry, the American, I forget the exact name, the Jewish Committee for Religious Freedom, who knows what that group is called, whatever it is, and then the Southern Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Freedom. They filed a brief for us as well, and they touched on areas that the briefs can only be so long, so our brief was pretty much packed, and they added things to it. The United States of America has 6 or 7 briefs filed as well, including one from Judge Roy Moore. You know who that was? The 10 Commandments judge in Alabama, who got kicked out of office for putting that big 10 Commandments on the, Montgomery Capitol there. And of course the National Day of Prayer Task Force and some other groups, Alliance Defense Fund, filed briefs arguing, first of all, that we don't have standing. We can't sue over something like that. Who are we to challenge, the standing of that? Or then arguing, well, there's no coercion involved. There's no coercion, so what? What's involved? If there's no coercion, then how are you hurt? How are we atheists and non-believers? How are we hurt if the president gets up and proclaims the day of prayer? What's the big deal, right? Well, I would say, what's the big deal if he stopped it? If it's no big deal, what's the big deal? But of course it's a big deal to the religious right. And I know not all Christians are like this. Not all Christians are that eager to mix religion and government. A lot of them, including some evangelicals, like Greg Boyd, who's a Twin Cities megachurch pastor, who says outright, America's not a Christian nation, and when you mix religion and government, they both get dirty. Christianity, he says, should be argued with persuasion, not with the force of government, especially a government that has a military. And that's another big issue that we can't talk about tonight, religion and the military. And so there's a lot of moderate and even some evangelical Christians who agree with us that state and church should be kept separate, and it's good for the country that they're separate because it protects freedom. But when we went to oral arguments then in December, one of the judges, Judge Mannion, who doesn't have a good record on state-church separation, was asking our attorney, what's the big deal? There's no coercion. Nobody's forcing you to pray, right? Do you atheists feel like the government's got a gun to your head saying you must pray now? He's just issuing a proclamation calling all Americans to pray. And you don't have to. You can ignore it. And our attorney turned to Mannion and said, coercion has never been an Establishment Clause test. Coercion is not the test. The 10 Commandments in high school classrooms was ruled unconstitutional. Any student walking by the 10 Commandments is free to ignore it, right? But the Establishment Clause isn't based on coercion. It's based on endorsement. If it looks like the government is endorsing, promoting, pushing one religious viewpoint, or hindering that religious viewpoint, it would be just as bad for president to get up and say, we're going to have a national day of cursing God because of Katrina. I mean, that would be just... You can bet people would see the importance of state-church separation, right? If that were to happen. They would say, wait a minute. What business does the government have interfering with my religious views? The government has no business. So it's neutrality is the real test. And Rich, our attorney, kept talking to Mannion. It's not coercion. Coercion is, look at all the precedent in the Supreme Court. Look at all the decisions. Coercion is not the test here. It's neutrality and endorsement. It's an endorsing, and the government has to be neutral. And our country is a great country because of the neutrality of government on religious issues, allowing all of us to believe, disbelieve, as we see fit. In America, we are free to disagree about religious matters. We are not free to ask our government to settle the argument. The government can't do that and shouldn't do that. The government should fold its arms and step back and say, hey, you argue among yourselves, talk among yourselves. The government, it only has secular civil powers. And actually that protects the religious powers, the clerical powers, from governmental intrusion. Because I don't think any church would want the government interfering with their business. By the way, we have another lawsuit that's under the radar right now, challenging the parsonage exemption that clergy get. Did you know that? A member of the clergy does not have to report their house payment or their rent as income. Lowers their tax liability. The rest of us have to. But for some reason, it was in the 1950s again, which is when Under God was put in the pledge in the 1950s, and when In God We Trust became our national motto in the 1950s. Also, this parsonage allowance was passed, which is unfair. It's giving an unfair advantage to members of the clergy. And the legislation at the time was to help the clergy fight our common enemy. Who was the common enemy? The godless communists, the godless Russians. So we're challenging that, and we think it'll help. It'll help the country economically, at least. I mean, and what church is going to argue? Well, we need the break because our God's too poor. You know, we need. You know, what church is going to argue that, right? If I were running a church, I'd be embarrassed to admit that our God couldn't afford to pay the bills. We had to go begging from tax dollars in order to do our mission. Benjamin Franklin said earlier in his life, that's one sign that it's not a good religion. A good religion doesn't need the help of government. A good religion can do it on its own. But as soon as a religion wants the help or the blessing or the endorsement of the government, there's a sign that something's wrong with that religion. It's not a good religion. It's not cutting it. It's admitting that it can't do it without the help of all the taxpayers. So we had oral arguments in December, and we're waiting for a decision. We might lose. We've got a 3-judge panel. Mannion and Easterbrook are not the best on these issues. Judge Williams, though, she was wonderful. She was really up on it. In fact, she was arguing with Mannion about this. She said, if coercion is the test, what if the government were to get up and say, America is officially a Catholic nation? You're not coerced. Nobody has to do that, but we're declaring America as a Roman Catholic nation. You would think it's getting close to that now. You know how many justices in the Supreme Court are Roman Catholics? Do you know how many there are? It's 6 of them now that are out of the 9. Sotomayor's Catholic, right? So, or is it 7 now? Who's left? Anyway, a majority. In a country that was founded, the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you know what their main reason was for founding their colonies in the United States and on America?
Religious persecution.
It was anti-communism. They were escaping religious persecution, but it was not communism, anti-Catholicism. But it is the same difference because the early church was communistic, when you think about it. The early Christian church shared all those things. In fact, people who didn't share, who lied, were actually struck dead, Ananias and Sapphira. The early colonists in America were anti-Catholic. They hated the whore of Rome. They hated this whole Catholic thing. It took a long time for Catholics even to be considered a part of the fabric of our country, except in a few places. But now, Catholicism, of course, we realize is welcome. We would never think of going back and adopting those divisive views of the... Those weren't the founders, by the way. Our country was founded a century and a half later. Our country was founded in the 1770s, 1780s. And if we're going back to the Mayflower, why go back there? Why not go back to my ancestors, the Native Americans? We were on this continent 12,000 years ago. That was 6,000 years before the earth was created. We were... Why think that this nation was founded by a few people, a few invaders from another continent? I mean, isn't there a little bit of a racist thing there? That they have to be European white Christians who have the value. Of course, there's that old joke, the Puritans loved religious freedom so much that they kept it all to themselves. And they did. They fought, they excluded, they banished, they persecuted, they wouldn't let people vote who didn't believe in the Trinity, and so on. All these colonies back then were little tiny mini theocracies, and our founders, more than a century later, had the wisdom to say, we're tired of that. We don't want this divisiveness and this fighting. We're going to have the first country in history, the first constitution in history to officially separate state and church. We were the first to do it. It was an experiment. They were very science-minded back then, and they were doing this experiment. Let's see what happens. It's never been done before. To have a country that's not based on some authority up above. Before that time, all governments were run by some sovereign monarch, a king, a lord, a church, an establishment, and the authority came from above to the people. But our government turned it totally upside down. The first time in history, we start with we the people. The consent of the governed. That never was done before, and there is no authority. Our founders hated the idea of an absolute authority over we the people, be it a king or a church or whatever. So they wrote the first constitution in history that completely separates state and church. It's a godless document, no mention of God or Jesus. And the Bill of Rights is, you know, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, the first phrase, is sometimes called a freedoms of conscience. There's 5 freedoms in the bill in the First Amendment: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and to petition the government. Those 5 freedoms are loosely called freedom of conscience. The government doesn't interfere with our private conscience to believe or not believe. But before any of those 5 freedoms are spelled out, guess what happens first? A non-freedom. The very first words of the very First Amendment is a non-freedom, not to the people, but to the government, telling the government, hey, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Then it goes on to tell us to enumerate our freedoms. It doesn't grant our freedoms, it just recognizes them. We have these freedoms as human beings. So that establishment clause, there's 2 parts to religion in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's the establishment clause, the free exercise clause, and they're like different sides of the same coin, right? So that establishment clause is the bread and butter of our organization. We win our lawsuits based on that establishment clause, when the government does anything respecting an establishment of religion. And by the way, some people on the religious right think they have this great argument by pointing out that it says Congress, right? It says Congress. States can do what they want, can't they? Can't mayors and city, county executives? No, they can't. That has been expanded, and the 14th Amendment, especially the due process, has applied all of the Bill of Rights to all of the states. So you can't have one state violating the Constitution. There are some things in our Constitution that are hardwired there that no majority can vote away. Some majorities wanted to vote away. They had segregation in the South. We had to bring in federal troops to say, look, you don't have the majority rule here to overrule the Constitution. No local school board can vote to say we're going to have prayer in our schools, or we're going to put the 10 Commandments in our schools. By the way, in Virginia, in Giles County, they did vote to put the 10 Commandments in their public schools. And guess who's going to sue over that? That's a no-brainer. It's already been decided. They are renegades. They're rebelling against established law. They're breaking the law, sending a bad message to the students that whether you like it or not, we should follow the law in this country. And they're thumbing their nose at the Constitution. So we're waiting for a decision. Depends on Mannion and Easterbrook. Williams is great on those 3 judges. If we lose, we will appeal to the entire 15-judge panel, which you can do. And if we win, of course, we're going to stop. We don't want to go to the Supreme Court. When you're winning, you don't want to go higher. You want to stop. If we do win in Chicago, if Judge Crabb's decision is upheld, as it should be because it's a great decision, then what are the chances that Obama will appeal that? Some people speculate, and I'm not going to try to second-guess Obama on this. some people speculate Obama values religious freedom, and as a constitutional authority, he knows that it's wrong for the government to be promoting religion, but he would rather have it look like he was forced to stop, rather than him coming up and saying, yeah, I agree we shouldn't have prayer. It's probably a political thing that's happening, that if the courts force it, then it's going to be forced. Right now, it's unconstitutional. Right now, it's illegal. Right now, what Obama did last May, and what he's going to do again this next May, is against the law, according to a federal judge. Of course, it could be appealed, and we could lose. And what are our chances at the Supreme Court? Probably not good with the current Supreme Court. If they do rule against us, it will be very interesting to see how, to see why, in light of the precedent, in light of our history, in light of the errors, in light of the fact that this bill was passed clearly with religious intent, and a secular government is not supposed to have a religious intent. It would be very interesting to see what these justices might use as an argument to justify a secular government promoting religion. So watch it and don't pray. Watch it and it'll be in the news sometime when that decision comes down. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has 16,000 members. We're growing fast. We're the largest group of atheists and agnostics in the nation. We publish a newspaper, Free Thought Today. We have a weekly radio show called Free Thought Radio. This week we interviewed the actor Madison Arnold, which is a really fun show. You've seen him in a bunch of movies, Escape from Alcatraz and Presumed Innocent with Harrison Ford. He was in Donnie Brasco. He was a bunch of movies, and TV and on the stage. And he's been a member of our group since 1980, and he talks about his life as a freethinker and as an actor. And we couldn't get him to reveal any more names. We wanted him to tell us, you know. But anyway, it's a fun show. We just did about 250 shows. We're almost up to 5 years now. And you can stream it or you can subscribe to the podcast to hear Free Thought Radio. Okay, I'm going to stop there, Trevor. Are we done or do you want to do questions?
We got time for some questions. If
you do? Okay. Great. Is there someone in the middle back there? Okay.
Just a couple of questions. Hi, I'm Kelsey. As an educator, I was reading up on you before I came today, and I noticed that you published some free thought-centered children's books. What has been your experience with educators using those with kids in schools? If educators have used those, have people said, hey, don't teach my kids to think or anything like that? Anyway, what sort of response have those books been met with in schools?
So you're going to be a teacher then?
Yeah.
I think that's the highest calling in this country, what you're doing. And it's so undervalued, you know. We should
Underpaid as well.
Underpaid. Really, being a teacher in the schools is one of the highest, most wonderful things anybody could choose to do. But I don't know, I don't have any experience of any of my books being used in public schools. Mostly it's parents who buy them for children. Although there was a library in a California city who refused to stock one of my books because some freethinkers suggested, here, put this book in the library, and they refused to, and they didn't say why. They just said, oh, it's not a very good book. And how can you complain? You can't force a library to carry books, but there might have been some censorship in there. But I hear from families who, you know, they're aimed at kids like 8 to 10 to 12 years old. One's on the scientific method, one's on morality. How do you decide what's right and wrong? And one of them is a real hard-hitting free thought book on, you know, comparing God and Santa Claus. And, I have some atheist parents who say, I don't know if I want to show that to my kids yet because they still believe in Santa. So maybe they should wait on that. But so I don't have anything to say about my books. Yeah, up here. Okay.
We hear that like 2/3 of the country say America's going in the wrong direction, and I agree with the Tea Party that Washington doesn't listen to us, and I think it's kind of critical we first define what direction the country's going and what direction we want it to go, and we need to be sure we know who does Washington listen to. And I think if you answer all those questions correctly, it's the great disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor that have people have this great dissatisfaction here. I'm kind of curious if we had maybe a return to the 50s where people lived an easy middle-class life, you know, they felt secure in their jobs, would we be having this interest in conservative religions and having the same breath guns?
I was raised in the 50s too, and I was lucky. I had a fun childhood. But the 50s were, there were a lot of parts of the 50s that weren't that great. You know?
Well, just say in general, if people in the country now were more generally prosperous and secure in their lives and their sustenance, do you think we would have this emphasis on, say, radical religion? No, and the studies all show that. Did you hear his question? All the studies show the better off the country is, the less religion it has. Look at Northern Europe. Look at Europe. Look at how, by any measure, the Danes and the Norwegians and the Swedes have the best societies in the world. Infant mortality, happiness, equality, contentment with their jobs, you name it, their healthcare system and all that. Their life is wonderful there, and their religion is almost nothing. By contrast, there's a few outliers, but by contrast, the countries that are struggling the worst, where there's a huge disparity, where there's huge problems, have more religion. And it might be because, and you know, Phil Zuckerman and others have hypothesized that when things are going bad, you want to reach out and win the cosmic lottery. You want to, you know, you want to be saved from the misery that you're in. But when things are going well, you don't need that. So ironically, religions like right-wing believers have an investment of keeping things messed up. You don't want things going well. If things are going well, then people don't need to cry out to God. In fact, a lot of sermons you hear, things are bad, things are horrible. You can only sell something to someone if they have a need for it, right? But how much respect should we have for a doctor who runs around cutting people with a knife in order to sell them a Band-Aid, right? That's kind of what Christianity is. You're bad, you're going to go to hell, things are horrible, you have this, and you need to be saved, right? Which is a real put down. So look what's happened in Europe, and look what's happening in this country through just an organic relaxing of religion and an increased lifestyle, and when people are better off. I think you're absolutely right. There's less need to try to reach outside of the natural world when things are going a lot better. So maybe instead of getting up and preaching atheism, we should be preaching economic equality. We should be preaching universal health care. We should be preaching equal rights for women and civil rights. We should be, and especially we should be preaching education and science in the schools. And let people believe or not believe. You can be a strong atheist without even using the word atheist, by pushing strong human values over supernatural values, I think. Okay, how about here with the...
I was just wondering, I know what, for the most part, what our response would be, but what do you think the public response would be if the Supreme Court did vote in favor of the National Day of Prayer, despite all of the evidence?
Yeah, did you hear the question? What would the public's response be? Well, the religious right would celebrate. They would see it as a vindication that their prayers were answered. They would put a lot of confidence and praise in the wisdom of the Supreme Court, although they weren't so confident back with Roe versus Wade, right? You tend to celebrate when the court agrees with you. When we had a case in 2007 where we thought we were winning, we thought it was 5-4 in our favor. But Sandra Day O'Connor left, and she was replaced by Alito. So then there was no swing vote. In fact, on the radio show, we played the song. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And Alito then went the other way, so it was 5-4 against us. But 4 justices of the United States Supreme Court agreed with us. That was just a split decision, and wrote a wonderful dissent saying that the majority had no reason for what it was. They use some excuse. And there's something about religion that can fog up people's judgment. It's very, very difficult to be deeply religious and vote against your religion. You can do it. Judge Jones in the Dover case in Pennsylvania is a church-going conservative Christian appointed by a Republican, and yet he voted against intelligent design in the public schools because, rationally, intelligent design is not science. So he voted the right way against his own private religious views. So that's what we need in the court, is real objectivity. But if we lose, Nothing will change. It'll just validate. They'll have big celebrations, they'll have more big meetings, and they'll say, yeah, we can do what we want. And that won't stop us from complaining and filing other lawsuits on other issues, but we want to test it. And if we win, there's also the possibility, it would be a long shot, that Congress would want to amend the Constitution. So wait a minute, we keep losing God, we prayer in the schools and all these things we keep losing. That's a possibility, in which case it would be forcing the country to show its true colors. What kind of a country are we? Are we a country that values freedom and equality and state separation, or aren't we? And if we are not, let's learn that. Let's see what kind of a country we are. Is there a woman here who hasn't? No? No? Well, way in the very back then.
I imagine when you made your switch and decided to come out as an atheist that you had a lot of friends and family who might have been shocked and upset about that. How did you deal with that, and how was that reconciled, if at all?
You all heard the question? How did my family and friends deal with me coming out? I write about it in the book, Godless. But it was everything. If you can imagine the response, I got it. I got some wonderful, loving, kind, friendly responses from Christians who were still friends today. They're really good people, and we like each other as friends. Carl Ferrer, who was the vice president at Manna Music, who published my Christian musicals back then in the 70s. In fact, I'm still getting royalties. Which is really weird. Last year I got a check for $1,017 for Manna Music. And I always forget about it each year, so it's kind of nice. But I signed that check over to the Women's Medical Fund, which helps poor women pay for abortions. And Katie... And that's not an atheist thing, because I think most Christians support abortion rights too. It's just the extremists that don't. But and Katie, the bookkeeper, said, "Dan, should we send a thank you note to the Christian publisher?" But I also got some responses that were surprisingly ugly, really horrible, from people that I thought were my friends. It was like, "Whoa, I was possessed of the devil, or I was evil, or I had moral reasons. I didn't." My change was intellectual, but they were not trying to dig for some moral or psychological thing that went wrong with me, you know. Anything but perhaps the fact that maybe their religion is false. I mean, they couldn't deal with that, a lot of it. And so I lost some friends. My mom was a Sunday school teacher. She got on a bus and came out, and we talked all night long. She went home, and she stopped going to church.